So today we are joined by Nicola Leyshon. She is a graduate student at Oklahoma State University working towards a PhD in Fire and Emergency Management Administration. She specializes in the analysis of natural hazards and risk using GIS. She's originally from the United Kingdom, and she now works as a GIS technician at the City of San Luis Obispo, and also as a GIS and fire behavior consultant throughout the state of California. She has a bachelor's in science and environmental economics and ecology from the University of York, England, and a master's of science degree in forestry sciences from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And with that, I will turn it over. Thank you.
Hello?
Hello, you sound great. Take it away. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So, hello everyone. Sorry about that. Small technical issue. So yes, my name's Nicola Leyshon. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today I'm going to talk to you about a project that began as my master's thesis with Dr. Dykes at California, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And I'm going to talk to you about the project we did for the master's thesis, and then also go into some of the changes that have happened to the model since then and how I'm now changing it to, over time, develop it into a PhD dissertation. So the project was called Temporal Changes to Fire Risk in Disparate WUI Communities in Southern California. And I'll just jump right in. So we aren't going to go through this whole table, but I have a few points here that I'd like to share with you to indicate why I chose to look at the wildland-urban interface and why there's a problem. So firstly, notice that the majority of these large destructive fires have happened in Southern California and many in San Diego County. Also, as you may notice, not all of the largest structure losses have been in the greatest areas and the greatest acreage. And as you know, this is because they're happening in the wildland-urban interface, and you can have major losses over small areas when these fires enter urban areas, such as the Oakland Hills Tunnel Fire of 1991. So often, these large catastrophic wildfires result in major policy responses. I've included this table. So here you can see over the last 54 years, these fires and which policy changes they've resulted in. So just to pick out a couple of examples here, you can see the Oakland Hills Tunnel Fire of 1991, and that resulted in bringing in the Bates Bill, where we then had to identify the fire hazard severity zones in LRA. Also, the Cedar Fire in Southern California in 2003, 15 people lost their lives and just under 5,000 structures were destroyed. And this resulted in the changing of defensible space policy to 100 feet or 30 meters. So talking about the Cedar Fire, here is the firestorm, Southern California firestorm of 2003, and there you can see where the Cedar Fire is in that. As I said, 15 people lost their lives. It was a major catastrophe for Southern California. And as we just discussed, they brought in new defensible space law for this. And yet, in 2007, there was another Southern California firestorm, which included the Witch Fire. And as you can see, if I just go back and forth, you can see they pretty much happened in the same area. And although there was a slight reduction in acreage and a reduction in deaths, there was still a major catastrophe for the area. And so this was sort of the basis for our project, to wonder why is this happening and is the policy working that's being implemented. So here's just a quick diagram just to be clear on the definitions of risk and hazard. So risk is your expected damage, what could happen, and then your hazard is the physical conditions that can cause damage. And for this study, we used the definition that fire risk is hazard minus the mitigations that have been put in place. So these are our research questions that we came up with for the project. Is fire risk increasing as people develop out into the wildland-urban interface? One thing that you hear a lot in the field is, well, people just shouldn't build out in these areas. But if we are changing policy and building more fire-resistant homes and safer communities, well, we wanted to figure out, is risk actually increasing, and what is changing over time? Our second research question was, how are homeowners responding to catastrophic wildfire mitigation policy? So are people putting in more defensible space and improving their homes as these catastrophic fires are happening? And then finally, are mitigation levels different across disparate communities? So to answer these research questions, these were our objectives for the study. So first of all, we took historical imagery and also GIS data to look at and try and detect factors that would influence whether or not a home would be lost. So defensible space, building materials, whatever is possible to capture with GIS. And then we wanted to take areas where fires had happened and see which of these factors may have influenced whether or not a structure was lost. So we developed a GIS model to assess these changes in probability of structure loss over time. And then finally, we analyzed the risk through time in 3 communities that vary in demographics, socioeconomic status, and local culture to try and figure out what might be the reasoning for these changes in risk if we do in fact find any. So for this study, our study sites were Rancho Santa Fe, Ramona, and Julian in San Diego County. Rancho Santa Fe represents upper-income wildland-urban interface community. Ramona represents a larger community, and Julian a smaller, more rural community. So we chose these sites as they differ in community type, vegetation type, and structure type, but they've also all experienced large catastrophic wildfires. As you can see in this image, both Rancho Santa Fe, Ramona, and Julian experienced the Witch Fire, and Ramona and Julian both experienced the Cedar Fire in 2003. So this is Rancho Santa Fe. It's a very beautiful place. Lots of ornamental landscaping. It has a close proximity to chaparral, wildland vegetation. Definitely not what I would describe as an average home, but that is in fact an average home for Rancho Santa Fe. It's the 1% of the 1%, and this community is known for fire safety. There's many local ordinances to reduce risk, and the community in general are very invested in their fire safety policy. Our second community was Ramona. This has a lower average income than Rancho Santa Fe, many more structures, and a more diverse population. Ramona also suffered many losses in the 2007 Witch Creek Fire, and this photo here would be an average home in Ramona. And our third study site, Julian, is a very beautiful town. If you haven't been, I highly recommend going. It's got very old construction, lots of wooden houses, lots of coniferous trees, and many holiday homes, lots of log cabins in the woods, much more of a rural feel than the other 2 study sites. So these study sites, we chose them to try and be representative of the different kind of wildland-urban interface communities across California. So here is our general methodology that we used. So we collected data, both imagery and GIS, for the years 2005, 2009, 2010, and 2012. We ran a GIS data analysis to look at land use changes over time and fire risk over time, including both multispectral and hyperspectral imagery analysis. We did a spatial defensible space analysis, verified the data with a sample survey of homes on the ground, and then fit the mitigation model using SPSS to try and find out what kind of variables could be influencing the loss or survival of a home. We then developed a final fire risk model and then did a comparison over time of the different communities with their demographics to try and explain some of the reasons that these risk levels might be different. So this was the first step. Here was our trying to figure out where is the wildland-urban interface being developed and where are the new parcels. So one limitation of this study, and I'll talk later about how we've changed this now, but during this study we didn't have the year each structure was built. And so what we did in its place was to look at the year that the parcel was zoned for containing structures, to look at how the city has expanded over time. Now, as you know, that would cause a limitation because structures can be updated and new permits can be brought in, roofing ordinances and things like that. But one aspect of a GIS analysis is you're often limited by your data. And so the model aims to collect as much as is possible with what we could have. And this is the results of that there. So we found that the wildland-urban interface was expanding in all of the 3 study sites. The most rapid development was in Rancho Santa Fe. And the largest population of non-urban land was in Julian, which was not surprising given our site visits. There's quite a lot of vegetation in that area. So the next step was to try and use GIS and imagery to detect where is the vegetation, especially in relation to the homes, and look at defensible space in general. So what we used for that was the National Agriculture Imagery Program imagery, or NAIP. We had that for 2005, 2009, 2010, and 2012. And this image here is an NDVI index image, which basically shows the health of the plants, so how much infrared is being given off. And this can also be useful for looking at fire risk and where the plants are being irrigated and where they're not. And these images were used for the classification of a vegetation layer to use in GIS. And this is what we got here. So here you can see a tree polygon. It's just one example. We did this for all the 3 sites for each of the years. And we had tree cover, also grass cover. And I've put in here, we got a 92% producer and user accuracy for the tree cover. And basically what that means is, how likely are you to find the right feature if you use this method? Now, as you can see, the accuracy for detecting urban materials is much lower, and that is because multispectral imagery was used for this part of the analysis. And urban materials are very varied, and so we used hyperspectral for that part. So these polygons, both the grass and the tree, were put into our defensible space model in GIS. And this is based on California law. We used the general defensible space policies. So we had a zone C out 1.5 to 9 meters, or 30 feet, which CAL FIRE refers to as the lean, clean, and green zone. So here, homeowners should clear dead vegetation and keep trees 10 feet apart. Zone D, which goes out to 30 meters, or 100 feet, is the reduced fuel zone. So here it's all about creating horizontal spacing between shrubs and trees, and also creating vertical spacing between grass, shrubs, and trees. So basically just trying to stop the fire from finding a pathway to the home. We also included the structure itself as Zone A, and then also Zone B, which was out to 1.5 meters, or 5 feet. And this was based on recommendations from the Institute of Home and Business Safety. So they recommend here that non-combustible materials are used in this area to basically to reduce the risk of embers landing and causing a ground fire, which could then ignite the structure itself. So as you can see in this image, we pulled in our tree and grass polygons, and we were able to measure with a certain amount of error, given that it's GIS data, where on each of the parcels the trees are and what percentage are in each of these zones, and also what percentage are overhanging the roofs. So this was our results for this part of the study. We found that for all the communities, the average cover in Zone A, so the structure, was 8%, in Zone B, 17%, and we found that overall, Rancho Santa Fe had actually reduced their coverage in tree cover, which is not surprising considering the amount of effort that community puts into their defensible space. And we also found that Ramona and Julian had increased tree coverage around the structures over time, with Julian being just over 5%. So the next step of the study was to try and detect roof type, which is quite difficult with imagery, given the different kinds of roof types that are out there, and also the level of resolution that's necessary to detect that. So we used Avarice imagery, which is hyperspectral imagery, and software called EMVI. And basically, it's quite simple. As you can see here in this image, this is the spectral reading for a woodshake shingle roof. And so we did a site survey where we found where the woodshake roofs were, and then put it into the software, and it would then run an analysis on the entire image and find where other woodshake shingle roofs are. And as you can see in this image here, the reason we picked out woodshake shingle roofs in particular is because they are very hazardous in the wildland-urban interface and can result in a home burning down quite easily. And this methodology was based on Harold et al., which is a UC Santa Barbara study where they detected urban materials in Goleta. So here was the result of this. We found 85 structures were identified as woodshake roof out of 2,089 homes in Rancho Santa Fe, and then out of that, 70 were verified to actually have woodshake roofs, using both an on-site Visit and also Google Earth. So we found that this method was 82% accurate. Unfortunately, this hyperspectral imagery was only available for Rancho Santa Fe and not all 3 of our study sites, and so we couldn't use it in the overall model, but it was an interesting part of the study to test a GIS method for looking for roof type. Oh, and one more point on this. So we found that 89% of these wood shake shingle roofs were homes built to pre-1990. And so in absence of being able to detect structural materials and roof type with GIS, we used the year that the structure was built to try and infer the kind of structural materials that may have been used, given that different laws and building codes are in place in those years. So this is just in here to give you an idea of all the different things that we originally looked at to include in the model. But this model here was quite subjective and included a lot of things that we would think would cause a house to burn down. And so what we then did was use statistics on past fires to find out of all these factors, what could actually influence a house either surviving or being lost during a wildfire, and what kind of statistics can we use to back up our model. And so we used known locations of homes that were destroyed in the Witch Fire in 2007, and our imagery and GIS analysis for those homes just before the fire. I then ran a binary logistic regression to find whether or not each of these factors could have influenced the loss or survival of a home. And all these black dots here are the homes that were destroyed, and you can see around them lots of homes that survived. And we included a 0.5 kilometer buffer here to account for embers that could be landing on these homes. Overall, in our sample, there were 3,669 structures. And as you can see down here, these are all the different things that we put into the model. So this was the results of our statistical analysis. And so just for anyone who doesn't know, the reason it's a binary logistic model rather than a regular regression is because our dependent variable is binary. So the Y was, did it burn or did it survive? So here is our results. We found the period of urban development to be highly significant. The percentage of trees in zone B, which is that first 5 feet right outside the home or out to 1.5 meters, the percentage of grass in zone B, and also distance from wildland vegetation. And we found that the average tree cover in the homes that were destroyed during the Witch Fire was 18%, and the average grass cover in the homes that were destroyed during the Witch Fire was 11%. And so these were the numbers we then chose to use sort of as a level of where we would consider the cover in zone B to be a higher or lower risk. So then after we had fit the model, this is what we then were left with. And obviously there's a lot more factors that would go into whether or not a house would burn down, but what we wanted to do was try and only use factors that we found to be significant in the statistical model. And so as you can see here, this is the mitigation. So looking at each structure, whether or not there is poor, moderate, or good mitigation. And this would then be fitted into the overall model of fire risk equals hazard minus mitigation. So again, here are some of the limitations of this GIS model. So here are some things that would affect whether or not a house would burn down that cannot be detected with GIS. So the ground cover right next to the house, often the roof will hang over, and from aerial imagery, it's impossible to see what is right up next to the house. Vents and other openings where embers could get in, vertical continuity of the landscaping, siding materials, leaf litter and property hygiene, and also tree species. So with tree species and vertical continuity of the landscaping, this can be done with LiDAR, and as I'll discuss later, is now being included in the new model. But for this model for San Diego, that data was not available. And so these were some of the limitations of this model for San Diego. So here are the results of the home ignition zone mitigation model. Ramona had the greatest number of homes with poor mitigation, and Rancho Santa Fe had the highest percentage of structures with poor mitigation. So Rancho Santa Fe had the greatest improvement in mitigation over the 7-year study period. And often the defensible space in Rancho Santa Fe, although it looked poor, it's often actually more to do with ornamental landscaping than natural vegetation. So that was an interesting difference between Rancho Santa Fe and Julian, whereas the poor defensible space in Julian was often a result of small parcels and having a cabin right out in the wildland vegetation. So our overall model here, as you can see, was risk is hazard minus mitigation. So for this model, our hazard was quite simply used by the Cal Fire Hazard Severity Zone model and areas. And so in the new model, we're now including lots of different hazard factors, but for this study, this is what we use to indicate fire hazard. And then the implemented mitigation, we used the proximity to wildland vegetation, period of urban development, defensible space, and the proximity of other structures try and represent structure to structure fire spread. So here's the risk model overall. So for each parcel, for each of the 4 years of study, for each of the 3 communities, we had a home ignition zone mitigation score, and then also a hazard level. And then using the simple model of hazard minus the mitigation is the risk, we were then able to attribute a risk level for all of the parcels in each of the communities. And here's the results of our risk model. So as you can see here, Julian had the greatest proportion of very high-risk structures, and this wasn't surprising given the site study and also the reliance of the model on hazard itself and defensible space, which visiting Julian, there's a lot of wildland vegetation, as I said, and also a lot of small log cabins. Rancho Santa Fe had the greatest reductions in risk over the 7 years, and the proportion of very high-risk structures in Ramona increased over the 7-year study period, which was interesting. So one of the results of our project was we were able to map out the structures given the risk levels for each year. And so here is one of the maps for Rancho Santa Fe. And one use of this model is really to be able to find clusters of homes that may be higher or lower risk, so that then management agencies can identify areas where more mitigation may be needed. So in Rancho Santa Fe, we found that the very high risk was in the higher income areas. And in Rancho Santa Fe, unlike Julian, as I said, this is often the result of a lot of ornamental landscaping and also being out in the chaparral vegetation. There's a lot of secluded hilltop mansions in wildland vegetation, as I said. There was poorer mitigation in the lower income areas also, and a high prevalence of ornamental vegetation and secondary structures. So in the lower income areas, we did find still, as we saw before, some wood shake roofs and generally lower fire safe structures themselves, whereas in the higher income areas, it was an issue of ornamental vegetation. So these are the results for Ramona. In Ramona, unlike Rancho Santa Fe, the very high-risk areas were in the lower income areas. And here we found poor mitigation, and with the demographics also, there's a larger family size and a lower disposable income. So here is where we start to wonder what might be some limitations to implementing this defensible space policy and lowering the overall risk of your property. And finally, here's Julian. So Julian had a very high risk overall, as you can see. There's a really high fire hazard in Julian. There's steep slopes, lots of little windy roads going up into the forest, and lots of coniferous trees. There's also a lot of wooden construction. So we found that the poor mitigation was in the high income areas. Possibly in Julian, this could be a result of a lot of holiday homes and people being vacant properties, basically, where the mitigation isn't being done regularly. So in answer to our research questions from the beginning, found, is fire risk increasing as people develop out into the wildland-urban interface? Well, we found that it depends on the construction and defensible space. It could pose an increased risk, but also if the defensible space and the construction is done right, it could potentially provide a fire break for the older communities as the community expands. How are homeowners responding to catastrophic wildfire mitigation policy? So we found that mitigation did improve after the 2007 witch fire. However, there is still wood shake roofing in the wildland-urban interface. So there's more going on than a simple case of people not responding to the wildfire. There must be social limitations in place there. So are mitigation levels different across disparate communities? We found yes, they are. Both the level of mitigation and the type of mitigation differed across the demographic groups. So the conclusions of our study, we found that the clearance of the initial zone, so out to 1.5 meters, is the most critical for home survival during a wildfire. We actually found that this first zone, it is twice as important, how much tree cover you have there than grass, which makes sense as the trees can often connect a fire up to the roof and cause embers and fire to burn down the house from the roof. We also found that limitations to implementation differ across communities. So things like disposable income, whether or not there are vacant homes, the physical ability to do maintenance, especially landscaping, and also a lack of education regarding the hazard. So here are some management implications of our study. Basically, one size does not fit all. Low-income communities could use incentives and financial assistance to undertake mitigation strategies. Especially with roofing, it's very expensive to replace a roof and requires a lot more than simply taking off a wood shake roof and putting on tiles. And so in these poorer communities, it may take some incentives to help people do this. In the high-income communities, alternative landscaping education is good, and also community involvement. Rancho Santa Fe have a fantastic landscaping guide that I really like, and it approaches defensible space rather than from a fire-safe perspective, but from a landscape and style perspective, so recommending fire-safe plants for their style aspects so that developers and homeowners can feel like they could really use it and still get the look and style of their landscape that they want whilst complying with defensible space. And then also vacant properties. So with places like Julian, when we have all these cabins in the woods and places where no one's there most of the year, a communication with those owners to remember to be doing defensible space and keeping their property safe and their community safe, even when they're not living in the community. So this project is ongoing. This was the project, as I said, that we did for the master's degree. After we submitted the thesis last June, I've been working continuously to improve the model. So I thought I would include some information on the improvements that have been made. So now currently we have more detail in the hazard assessment. So things like extreme weather, microclimates, fire history, ignition history, and wind patterns are being included. Also, I'm doing the study now in San Luis Obispo City and San Luis Obispo County, and so I now have the actual year built, including when the local area has implemented fire codes and roofing ordinances and when homes are being updated, which gives a much more accurate view and image of what structural materials could be being used in this home. We also currently have LiDAR data, which is allowing for the height of the structure and the vegetation canopy to be looked at in the model, and also the vegetation type. So depending on the kind of vegetation you have around your home will affect the flame height and how quickly, or if at all, the fire will travel to your house. And so that's a really important new addition to the model. Also, one thing we're now looking into is using and allocating standalone scores for other types of vulnerability that can be used to identify specific risks. And Dan Turner, who's listening to this talk, this was his idea. And so basically looking at not only mitigation for the entire parcel, but what kind of vulnerability do you have for your structure and also for your parcel? And then also, what kind of homeowner vulnerability is there for evacuation and socially? And so all of these things are going to be going into this new risk model. And then also, lastly, looking at critical infrastructure. And on each of these parcels, what is the potential for economic loss? And so the next steps for the study, as I mentioned, my current research is focused on the development of the model to map parcel, structural, social, and economic fire risk across WUI communities. But here in this slide are the next steps for this research project. So I'm currently working on implementing the risk model into a fire modeling methodology to map potential fire spread within the community over time. And later, I hope to integrate the fire models with an animated evacuation modeling to visualize the efficacy of evacuation routes, giving a certain fire spread scenario. So really just trying to model as much as you possibly can with GIS of what is going on during these evacuations and these disasters, sorry. So for this project, I'm going to be applying the improved risk model across the wildland-urban interface areas of San Luis Obispo County, including San Luis Obispo City and also Cambria. And then I'm looking into and investigating social vulnerability, perception, and reaction to risk, given the proximity to hazards. And then also investigating the economic impacts of critical infrastructure loss and how are we prioritizing the mitigation around this critical infrastructure, and how do we figure out what would be more damaging to the county and the state and even the country than other things. So here are our sources of funding for the San Diego project and all the people that have helped both in the San Diego project and then also currently, and some student assistants that really helped with a lot of the digitizing. It was over 11,000 structures, so it was a lot of work. So thank you to them. And yeah, so any questions?
All right, well, great job, and thank you for that. So what we're going to do is, if you have a question, please type it in that chat box on the left there. And while people are putting their questions together, I'm just going to do a few housekeeping things. So at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a couple of links. There's 4 links there. The first one is the WUI webinar series. So if you enjoyed today's talk, we have a couple more coming up, and you can click on that link to register or to get further information about them. Our next webinar is April 21st, and it's with Linda Green, who is the Cal Fire Division Chief, and she was the incident commander on the Valley Fire, so she's going to be talking about the case study of the Valley Fire and some lessons learned. Again, that's April 21st. And then in May, we have David Kahn, who's going to do a webinar on current state regulations regarding single-access subdivisions and do they actually work? And then in June, our final presentation will be the 2016 Butte Fire case study and lessons learned with a CAL FIRE representative. So that's the first link there I wanted to explain. The second one is the webinar evaluation. So this takes less than 5 minutes. It will also pop up in your browser at the end of this presentation. It not only helps us to know how the webinar went, but also we use these numbers to report back to our funding agency. So it's part of our evaluation, so it really helps us. So if you want to take a couple minutes, like I said, it's very helpful and we appreciate it greatly. The third link is the webinar page for today's talk, and that's where the recording, her thesis, and a PDF of the PowerPoint slides will be. Give me about a week or less to get the recording up, and if you registered, I'll let you know when that's ready to go. And then finally, if this was of interest to you today, we have a number of webinars about WUI and other topics, as well as research briefs, which are shortened 1 to 2 page summaries with management implications for various fire science topics, and some field trips. So if you want to be informed and stay informed, that's the best way to do it. I send out an email every month, once a month, to your inbox. So that's to sign up for that. So I have a couple questions. The first one, and I'm going to post it in the box here, is how did you learn the limitations of the homeowners in that one slide? So was there an interview or a social science component that you did?
So what we did in this San Diego study is we used demographic data from Esri Business Analyst Online. So we did not do interviews for this study. For the next component of the study, I am planning to do a sort of a spatial survey and also homeowner interviews to find out whether or not there's perceived limitations, and also lots of different factors. Whatever, we're still developing it, but whatever we can basically get and implement into the model, we'll be collecting. But for the San Diego project, we use demographic data to try and represent spatially where the different groups are and try and infer what some limitations might be.
Okay, great. The next one is for that variable, the distance to wildland vegetation. Did it matter what kind of vegetation it was? So shrubs versus trees, was that a component?
Right. So for the San Diego project, again, for the San Diego project, it was quite a simple model. And so that's one of the things that has been changed in the model, is now we're looking at not just how far are you from the vegetation, but also what kind of vegetation do you have a proximity to? And so in the San Diego model, we just looked at what is your distance from this wildland vegetation? And given that for each of these 3 studies, we knew that that wildland vegetation had in fact burned and does in fact burn, we just use distance. But now, as we're trying to develop it so you can apply it in all kinds of different areas for any town or city, we're going to be looking at that, yes, because obviously it is very important, and it'll affect not only whether or not you're at risk, but how much risk there is.
Okay, and our next one here is, can you expand on the different vegetation types vis-a-vis fire qualities?
So if I understand that correctly, then yes, so well, depending on the different vegetation, obviously you have like plants that are more hazardous and less. So there's wild plants that are more hazardous, but then also ornamental vegetation, such as palm trees and things like that, that we're going to be looking for. So whether or not it's a coniferous tree versus a broadleaf, we're going to try and get it as close to exact as we can, and also just groupings. And so we're going to be using knowledge from fire ecology people such as Dr. Dykes, to say what kind of groups would be more or less hazardous, and then also including ornamental vegetation. I'm not sure if that answered that question, but let me know.
Sure, and while if they have a response to answer that or not, here's another one for you. Have you shared these results with the 3 communities that you studied, and if so, what was their response?
So we haven't shared them directly with the communities yet. We're still working on dissemination and publication of the studies. It's still tidying everything up and getting out there, but we definitely plan to. Yes.
This one's a little similar to what you've maybe already answered. But was the ornamental vegetation ever done using more fire-resistant vegetation? So was it like a false positive if there was different plants that were being used? Just, you had that factor of, I think.
Right. Well, that's actually a really good question, because that's something I'm looking into now. So in the San Diego study, we were really unable to detect the types of vegetation. So as the person who asked that question said, it really matters whether or not they're fire resistant. And so that is something we're now going to be looking into, and really, like I said, really trying to get down to as much detail as possible in terms of what exactly is the vegetation that we're picking up with GIS.
And then same kind of lines too, do you know of any resources, so like a list of plants that is more or less fire safe and where they can get it?
I do. I have the Rancho Santa Fe landscaping guide, which is excellent. And then I'm sure Dr. Dykes will have some ideas to answer that question, and I can forward them to Stacy, and then maybe we could put the links on the site.
And I'll send it in the follow-up email. So for the person who asked that question, if you registered with us and if you've been receiving emails from me, I'll include that. But if not, I can start a private chat with you and you can give me your email so we can directly connect you. Looks like we have one more person who might be typing. And I will say, too, that we have a number of past WUI webinars on our past events, and I think some of them have talked about fire-resistant landscaping at certain points. So that's another good resource if you're looking for some good resources. Okay, here is the next question. With all the various grant opportunities out there, this type of study would be great to apply to other areas of different terrain and vegetation types, etc. Can you give me an estimate of the cost of the study?
That's a tricky one. That would be a really good question for Dr. Dykes, I think, because he is obviously, he's the lead investigator on the study and understands sort of where the costs come in. I would say with GIS studies in general, they tend to be a much lower cost than going out and collecting data by hand. But if you put your email in there, I can get back to you on that one.
Just as a note for the recording, I will be deleting the chat box, so people will not be able to see it in the recording. So if you feel comfortable sharing with the 33 participants who are on, I can grab your email now, or I can start a private chat with you. All right, I think that was some great questions. So I want to thank everybody today for joining us. We had a really diverse and large audience, so that's always super nice to have. And also a giant thanks to our speaker today. You did a great job. Thank you so much, and good luck with future endeavors. Unless if there's any other questions, feel free to type them.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to end a little bit early here today, but that just means we get to go to lunch earlier, hopefully. So thanks again, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you next time.